A Mother's Dream. In a small, peaceful village nestled between lush hills and winding rivers, lived Amara, a kind-hearted woman whose only desire in life was to have a child. For years, she and her husband, Kwame, had prayed for this blessing. Amara's gentle spirit and loving nature had made her beloved in the village, but her childlessness was a source of both sorrow and whispered conversations. Despite her best efforts to remain hopeful, there were quiet murmurs of pity when people spoke of her, and Amara felt the heavy weight of societal expectations. Kwame, on the other hand, was a man of quiet strength but growing frustration. He loved Amara deeply, yet as the years passed without a son, a sense of disappointment began to erode their once strong bond. Kwame's family, particularly his elders, had always expected a male heir to carry on the family name and traditions. He loved his wife dearly, but he could not help but feel the growing pressure of not meeting these expectations. His hope for a son became a silent shadow between them. Nia, Amara's closest friend, stood by her through the years of waiting. Nia had always been there to support Amara, from helping with chores to offering comforting words. But Nia's own feelings were more complex. Beneath the smiles and kind gestures, there was an undercurrent of jealousy. Nia, who had been married for a similar length of time, had been blessed with 2 children, both boys. Yet, in the quiet spaces of her heart, she couldn't help but feel that Amara's life had been unfairly blessed with more love and affection from Kwame, while she herself often felt overlooked and unheard in her own marriage. As time went on, the tension in the village grew. While many villagers were supportive and hopeful for Amara's happiness, there were others who couldn't help but murmur about her inability to conceive. Amara, despite her inner sadness, remained patient and strong, always hiding the sting of those whispers behind her warm smile. Then, one warm afternoon, Amara's prayers were finally answered. Amara awoke to a sense of excitement that she hadn't felt in years. Her heart raced as she looked down at the small, pale strip of paper in her hands. She was pregnant. After so many years of longing and disappointment, her dream was finally coming true. She could hardly believe it. Tears welled up in her eyes, not just from the joy of the news but from the relief. Kwame, when told, looked stunned. His usual stoic face softened, and for the first time in many years, Amara saw the joy in his eyes. But as the weeks went by, Amara noticed a shift in his demeanor. While he was happy, there was an underlying expectation that began to grow within him. He began to express his desire for a son. His desire for a male heir began to overshadow his gratitude for the child at all. His longing for a son was unmistakable, and Amara, though happy, could feel the weight of the pressure mounting. The village, too, buzzed with excitement and speculation. Would Amara have a son? Or would she face the same disappointment that had shadowed her life for years? Every visit to the market, every conversation with the neighbors, every well-wisher now had a deeper meaning. The expectation was clear: Amara's child had to be a boy. The pressure on Amara grew heavier with each passing day. Amara found herself torn. She wanted to make her husband proud, to give him the son he so deeply desired. But deep down, Amara longed for peace. She prayed not for a boy or girl, but for a healthy child who would be loved no matter what. Her heart carried hope, but her soul carried the weight of what it meant to live in a village where expectations could shatter even the most hopeful of dreams. As the months passed, Amara's belly grew round, and her dreams filled with visions of the child she would soon hold in her arms. But the shadow of expectation hung heavy, casting a long, uncertain veil over the joy of impending motherhood. The birth of the unseen child. The day Amara had awaited for so long had finally arrived. The sun had barely risen when she felt the first pangs of labor. Kwame rushed to her side, his face filled with both excitement and anxiety. It had been a long journey for them, but now the day had come when they would meet the child they had so longed for. After hours of labor, Amara finally gave birth, and the cry of her newborn echoed through the small room. It was a boy. Kwame stood frozen, tears welling in his eyes as he held the tiny, squirming baby in his arms. The joy in his heart was palpable, and for a moment, it seemed like nothing else mattered. Amara, exhausted but overjoyed, gazed at her son. His tiny fingers wrapped around hers, his soft skin warm against her chest. He looked like a perfect baby boy, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Kwame smiled, his heart finally at peace. The village's expectations had been met. But as night fell and the soft, orange glow of the evening sun disappeared behind the hills, something strange began to happen. Amara had laid her baby in his crib beside her, finally resting after the long, exhausting day. But when she awoke in the middle of the night to feed him, she was met with a shocking sight. The baby, still sleeping, seemed different. His body was now unnaturally still. His skin, which had been soft and warm, felt unevenly cool to the touch. As Amara reached out to gently touch his forehead, she froze. The baby's body was shifting. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, his tiny limbs began to stretch, his fingers elongating and changing shape. His once human form seemed to ripple and twist, as though the very essence of the child was transforming. His skin began to darken to a deep, shiny black, and faint scales appeared where smooth skin had once been. Panicked, Amara recoiled. The baby's eyes snapped open, glowing faintly in the dark, and his tiny mouth opened wide, revealing sharp, serpent-like teeth. Amara gasped, horrified. Her baby, her precious son, had begun to transform into something else, something she didn't understand. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to comfort the child, but no matter how much she held him, his transformation continued. His body was no longer that of a child but that of a serpent. She could still hear his soft cries, but they were now distorted, mingling with a low, hissing sound that sent chills down her spine. The child, though still appearing to be her baby in some ways, had become something entirely different, something dangerous, something she couldn't protect him from. Amara's mind raced, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. What had happened to her child? Was this a curse? Was this something she had brought upon him? Her tears flowed freely as she held him close, trying to understand the impossible situation she found herself in. The next morning, Amara was too terrified to speak of what had happened. She tucked her son into a blanket, hoping against hope that somehow the night's events had been a nightmare. But when she looked at him again, it was clear that the change was permanent. He was no longer just her baby, he had become something else entirely. When Kwame returned from his walk, Amara could hardly look him in the eye. The love and joy he had shown the night before had vanished, replaced with fear and confusion. As she showed him the child, his eyes widened in disbelief. This is not my son," Kwame whispered, his voice trembling with shock. He backed away slowly, unable to comprehend what had happened to his newborn. The transformation was too much for him to understand. His joy had turned into horror, and his love for the child seemed to evaporate into the air. That evening, Amara wrapped her baby tightly, trying to keep him hidden from the world. But no matter how much she tried to shield him, the village soon took notice. Whispers began to spread like wildfire. A child born to Amara, who had long been the subject of whispers about her childlessness, had become the center of a new kind of rumor, a rumor that no one could ignore. At the market the next day, the villagers stared as Amara walked through the square, her baby wrapped in a cloth on her back. Some stared with curiosity, others with suspicion. But the looks were no longer filled with pity for her inability to conceive, now they were filled with fear. "She carries a snake," an old woman muttered under her breath. "It's cursed," another whispered. "That baby is not human." Amara's heart sank as the words began to spread. The once friendly faces of her neighbors turned away, their eyes filled with fear. The women who had once offered her kind words now avoided her gaze, and the men who had greeted her warmly walked on the other side of the street. The weight of the village's scorn pressed down on her. The murmurs grew louder as the day passed. Someone shouted, "Kill it before it harms us all." A man, his face contorted with fear, pointed at the baby, his voice filled with rage. "That thing, it's a snake." Amara, terrified and confused, rushed back home, her heart racing. She couldn't understand why the village had turned on her, why they had begun calling her child a curse. She had wanted only the joy of motherhood, only to give Kwame the son he had always dreamed of. But now, in the eyes of the villagers, her child was nothing more than a serpent, something unnatural, something to be feared. Kwame, though still in shock, tried to calm the villagers when they came to their door, demanding to see the child. But when he brought the baby out, the village saw what they had feared: the baby had become a snake. The villagers, consumed by their terror, began throwing stones and sticks at the child, determined to rid themselves of the supposed danger. Amara screamed in horror as her baby was struck, but the damage was done. The child, no longer the innocent baby she had born, lay lifeless in her arms. The villagers, satisfied that the creature had been killed, retreated, leaving Amara and Kwame to mourn. The devastation of that moment shook Amara to her core. She had lost her son, and with him, a piece of her heart. The village's fear had cost her everything. But as Amara held her child's lifeless body in her arms, one thing became clear: this was just the beginning of a much darker and more twisted journey, one that no one, not even Amara, could have predicted. The transformation. The days following the death of Amara's baby were a blur of grief and disbelief. Amara clung to the memories of her child's innocent face, desperately trying to convince herself that what had happened was a horrible dream. But as the days dragged on, reality set in, and with it came a new, creeping fear. Kwame's disbelief. Kwame, who had been so full of hope for a son, found himself lost in confusion. When Amara first showed him the child, his baby boy, he had felt a rush of love and joy, but now, standing at the threshold of their home, looking at his wife, he felt nothing but a growing sense of dread. He could still see the baby's transformation, the scales, the sharp teeth, but his mind refused to accept it. In the quiet of the night, Kwame had tried to convince himself that the baby's strange appearance was some kind of nightmare. He would wake up, and everything would go back to normal. But no matter how many times he closed his eyes and tried to with the image of his son's monstrous transformation away, he could still hear the hiss, still see the serpent's gleaming eyes in his mind. As the whispers from the village grew louder, Kwame's mind became a battlefield. He no longer saw a child when he looked at his son, he saw the terror that the villagers saw. His fear took root deep inside him, and with it came a deep, aching doubt. Amara, in her desperation, tried to explain to him that their child had been cursed, that it was not their fault. But Kwame couldn't bring himself to accept it. The fear that had taken root in the village had also taken root in his heart. Every day, the villagers would come by their house, whispering behind their hands, throwing fearful glances in their direction. And Kwame, instead of defending Amara, began to withdraw. He was ashamed of what was happening, and even more ashamed of himself for feeling fear instead of love for the son he had once hoped for. Amara, though hurt by his withdrawal, understood the pressure he was under. She didn't blame him for his doubts. After all, how could anyone see their child transformed into something so unnatural and not be filled with fear? The curse deepens. Amara's love for her son never wavered, despite the dark transformation that continued to unfold. Each night, as she watched over him, she saw the changes grow more pronounced. The baby's body, though still small, had begun to take on more reptilian traits. His skin grew shinier, his eyes glowed with an unnatural brightness, and his movements became more erratic. What had once been a fragile newborn was now a creature of nightmare. But it was not just the baby who was changing. Amara herself was transforming, too. The once joyful woman who had dreamed of motherhood now found herself filled with dread. She couldn't go anywhere without hearing the whispers of the villagers. They would call her cursed, tell her she had brought evil into their midst. Some even went so far as to accuse her of witchcraft, claiming that she had somehow conjured this abomination herself. Despite this, Amara continued to care for her child, though each day it became harder to ignore the truth. The curse was real. Her child was not human. And as the curse deepened, so did the hatred of the village. At first, the villagers had been content with just whispering behind Amara's back, casting fearful glances her way. But as the days turned into weeks, their fears grew. It was as if the very presence of Amara and her cursed child was enough to send a ripple of terror through the village. The older women no longer spoke to her, the children no longer played near her house, and the men avoided her gaze altogether. One afternoon, when Amara ventured into the village square to buy food, a group of women gathered in front of her. They stood with their arms crossed, eyes narrowed in suspicion. Amara, one of the older women said in a low voice, "We have heard what your child has become. It is unnatural. You should leave before it brings us all harm." Amara felt the sting of their words, but she held her head high. She knew that if she showed any sign of weakness, they would tear her apart. But the words hit deeper than she could have imagined. She had never felt so isolated in her entire life. It wasn't just the villagers who were turning their backs on her, it was the world itself. Her home had become a prison, her heart a battlefield. That night, as Amara sat beside the crib where her child now slept, she whispered to herself, "What am I supposed to do?" But deep down, she knew the answer. She had no choice but to face the curse. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could protect her child. No matter what form he took, he was still her son. But even as she made this silent vow, something far darker was unfolding in the shadows. For the first time, Amara realized that the curse was not only changing her child, it was changing everything around her. And it would soon change the course of her life forever. The night seemed to stretch on forever, and as Amara closed her eyes, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. It was Kwame. But when he entered the room, his face was not filled with love, it was filled with fear. "Amara," he said, his voice trembling. "We can't stay here anymore." Amara's heart sank. "What do you mean?" "They know," he whispered. "The village, they've decided. They want us gone. If we don't leave, they'll do something worse." The curse had not only changed her son, it had changed her life, her marriage, and everything she had ever known. The village's hatred was growing stronger by the day, and Amara realized that her fight for her child's future had only just begun. A rival's evil scheme. Nia's jealousy. Nia had always been Amara's closest friend, a confidant who shared in her dreams and fears. For years, they had supported each other through the ups and downs of life in the village. But as Amara's pregnancy progressed, something began to stir in Nia's heart, something she couldn't ignore, no matter how much she tried. At first, she had been overjoyed for Amara. She had been the one to stand by her side, offering support through the years of waiting and uncertainty. But now, as Amara's pregnancy bloomed, Nia began to feel a deep, unsettling envy. She had been married for years, yet despite her own efforts, she had never been able to give her husband, Kwame, the son he so desperately longed for. Instead, she had borne him 2 daughters, sweet children who were loved but never enough to fill the growing void that Kwame had started to express in their marriage. Amara, with her gentle nature and quiet strength, had been blessed with a son, something Nia had failed to provide. And this filled her with bitterness, a feeling that she tried to hide behind a smile and warm words, but it festered within her, growing with each passing day. Amara had always been the center of Kwame's heart. She had always been the one to receive his attention, his affection, and his love. Nia, on the other hand, was merely a shadow, constantly competing for his approval. But now, with the news of Amara's pregnancy, that shadow grew even darker. Nia could feel the distance between her and Kwame growing, as if the love she had worked so hard to build was slipping through her fingers. The jealousy that had once simmered quietly in her heart began to boil over. The more she saw Amara glow with anticipation and love for the child growing inside her, the more desperate Nia became to take Amara's place in Kwame's life. In her mind, this child was the final obstacle standing between her and the life she so desperately craved. If she could not bear Kwame a son, then Amara's child must be the next best thing. The dark plan. Nia, consumed by her envy and bitterness, began to seek out ways to ensure that Amara's child would no longer be a threat to her place in Kwame's life. Desperation led her to an unlikely source, a healer known to possess strange powers, someone who was said to be able to manipulate the very essence of life. The healer was a mysterious figure in the village, one who dealt in whispers and secrets. People spoke of him in hushed tones, fearful of his abilities but equally afraid of what might happen if they crossed him. Nia visited the healer in secret, hiding her true intentions beneath the guise of concern for Amara's well-being. She arrived at the healer's hut under the cover of dusk, her heart pounding with the anticipation of what she might find. The healer welcomed her with a knowing smile, his eyes gleaming with a strange light. "What brings you here, Nia?" the healer asked in a voice that seemed both ancient and knowing. "I can sense the turmoil in your heart." Nia hesitated, but the healer's piercing gaze made it clear that he already knew everything. Her jealousy, her desire to replace Amara, the bitterness that had slowly eaten away at her soul, all of it was laid bare before him. "I want to make sure Amara's child is no longer a threat to me," Nia confessed, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. "I need to take my place in Kwame's life, and Amara's son is standing in my way." The healer nodded slowly, as though he had expected this request all along. He reached for a small vial from the shelf beside him, its contents shimmering with an eerie glow. "This potion," the healer explained, "when used on the child, will transform him into something far more terrifying than he already is. Something that will instill such fear in the villagers that they will never speak of him again except in whispers. It will be a creature of legend, feared and avoided by all." Nia's eyes widened. "How will it work?" she asked, her voice filled with both curiosity and a hint of dread. "The potion must be used while the child is sleeping," the healer instructed. "Once it is applied, his transformation will intensify. The villagers will see him as nothing more than a monster, a creature they will not dare approach. This will ensure that Kwame's heart remains with you, for he will never look at Amara the same way again." Nia's heart raced as she listened to the healer's words. In her mind, she could already see the end result, Amara's child transformed into something monstrous, something the villagers would fear, and Kwame's love returning to her. She would finally have what she had always wanted. Amara, who had once stood by her side as a friend, would be nothing more than a distant memory. With the vial in her hand, Nia left the healer's hut, a sense of dark satisfaction flooding her veins. She now had the power to change everything, to take Kwame back, to replace Amara as his true partner. All she had to do was carry out the plan. The potion's effect. The following night, under the cover of darkness, Nia snuck into Amara's house. She had watched carefully for days, waiting for the right moment to strike. As Amara slept beside her child, Nia crept into the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She approached the crib where Amara's child lay sleeping, his small form curled up beneath a blanket. Amara's gentle breathing was the only sound in the room, but Nia's own breath came in quick, shallow gasps as she prepared to execute her dark plan. With trembling hands, Nia opened the vial and poured the potion into the water that would soon bathe the child. She then carefully placed the bottle back in her bag and stepped back, her eyes gleaming with triumph. In that moment, she believed that her path was set, that her victory was all but assured. But what Nia did not know, what she could not have possibly foreseen, was that the potion she had used would not simply change the child into something that would instill fear. It would awaken something much darker, something far more dangerous than even the healer had predicted. As Nia retreated into the shadows, Amara awoke, sensing something was wrong. But it was too late. The curse had already begun to deepen, and the consequences of Nia's envy would soon be felt by everyone. The final reckoning. The twist. The days that followed Nia's dark plots were filled with a creeping sense of dread. Amara, despite her heartache, continued to care for her child, hoping that the transformation would eventually subside. She believed, in her heart, that no matter what happened to him, he would always be her son. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was unfolding beneath the surface. One afternoon, after hearing the familiar sounds of her baby's soft, rhythmic breathing, Amara decided it was time to bathe him. She had been so caught up in the care of her little one that she hadn't noticed the sinister presence of Nia slipping quietly into the room. Amara left her child in the crib, covered with a blanket, and stepped out to fetch some fresh water from the well. Nia, watching from the shadows, crept into the room. The vial she had acquired from the healer felt like a weight in her hands, the sinister liquid inside now the key to her dark plan. She poured the contents into the water Amara had set aside for the child, her heart racing with anticipation. She was certain that this would be the end of Amara's reign, the final step in taking everything that she had ever wanted. Amara returned to the room, completely unaware of the treachery that had been set in motion. She smiled at her son, still sleeping peacefully in his crib. But as she lifted him gently, ready to begin the bath, she froze. The transformation had not slowed, it had only deepened. Her baby, whom she had loved with all her heart, was no longer a baby at all. His small body was now fully that of a serpent, his scales glistening in the dim light of the room. His eyes glowed with an eerie intensity, his fangs sharp and gleaming. The child she had hoped for had become something unrecognizable, a creature of nightmare. A wave of horror washed over Amara. She backed away, holding the creature, her son, in her arms, unable to understand what had gone wrong. Her heart broke, tears streaming down her face as she desperately looked for an answer. The confrontation. Suddenly, a loud banging on the door interrupted her panic. "Amara," came the voice of Kwame from outside. He had returned to find the village at his doorstep, led by none other than Nia. The villagers, armed with sticks and iron rods, were shouting angrily as they gathered outside. "Let us in. We have come to end this madness," shouted one man. "Your cursed child must be destroyed before it harms us all." Amara's heart pounded in her chest as she quickly tried to cover her baby, to shield him from the eyes of the village. But it was too late, their voices had already penetrated the walls of her home, and fear spread through the crowd. Kwame, who had been in denial about the child's true nature, entered the house, his eyes widening in shock. When he saw the baby, a full-grown serpent now, with its fangs bared, his face twisted in terror. "Amara, what have you done?" he shouted, his voice filled with confusion and anger. Amara, struggling to understand, said through her sobs, "It's not what you think, Kwame. I didn't do this. He's my son, please, he's still my son." But the villagers, led by Nia's lies, would not listen. They had already been whipped into a frenzy, their fear and hatred now fully consuming them. They screamed for the child's death, their eyes burning with rage. "Kill it," shouted one of the villagers, his voice full of disgust. "It's a snake. It's cursed." As Amara tried to protect her son, holding him close to her chest, Kwame, caught between his love for Amara and the terror the villagers had instilled in him, hesitated. But his heart began to break as he saw the fear in Amara's eyes, and he knew, deep down, that she was right. This was not her fault. Amara's cries filled the room as the villagers advanced. But then, as the mob raised their weapons to strike, something incredible happened. The child, now fully a serpent, moved swiftly and decisively. In a flash of motion, the serpent lunged at Nia, its glowing eyes filled with rage. Before anyone could react, the serpent sank its fangs deep into Nia's chest. She screamed in agony, her body trembling with shock as the venom quickly took hold. Within moments, she collapsed to the ground, lifeless, her betrayal repaid by the very creature she had tried to destroy. The villagers stood frozen in terror, their minds unable to process what had just happened. The child, the creature they had feared, had struck, and the woman who had caused this tragedy was gone. Kwame's realization. As the room fell into stunned silence, Kwame rushed to Amara's side, his eyes wide with realization. He looked at her, then at the lifeless body of Nia, and something within him shifted. He had let fear and jealousy cloud his judgment for so long. He had distanced himself from Amara, believing that the child she carried was a curse, that the fear of the village would be his guide. But in that moment, standing beside Amara as she wept over their son, he saw the truth for the first time. The baby was not a monster, it was their child, cursed by forces beyond their control. The love that had once been overshadowed by societal expectations and fear had returned, but now it was stronger, purer, and unyielding. Kwame looked at Amara, his voice filled with sorrow and regret. "I was wrong," he said quietly, his eyes filled with tears. "I should have never let fear come between us. I should have never doubted you." Amara, holding her son close, nodded. "We've been through so much, Kwame. But we can't let the world decide our fate. We must choose love. That's all that matters now." The lesson. In the days that followed, the village slowly began to distance itself from Amara and Kwame. The whispers and stares never truly stopped, but they grew quieter, less intense. The couple knew that they could never return to the life they once had, not in the village where fear and jealousy ruled. So, they made the decision to leave, to start over somewhere far away where they could raise their son, free from the judgment of others. Together, they would face the future, united by love and the understanding that their happiness did not depend on anyone else's approval. As Amara and Kwame left the village behind, they knew one thing for certain: true happiness comes not from meeting others' expectations or fearing what others think, but from accepting and loving each other, flaws and all. Their child, no matter what form he took, would always be a part of their family, and they would never let anyone take that away. And so, they left behind the village, walking into a new life filled with hope, love, and the promise of a future free from fear.